you. Good afternoon. My name is Steve McLeod. I am the current president of the Coastal Society and an environmental scientist at WSP here in Buffalo, New York. Thank you for joining this session of TCS's Coastal Connections web conferencing series. The trending topic we will be covering today is aquaculture development in the US. Please note that this session is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the TCS YouTube channel in the coming days. For non-member guests, the Coastal Society is a nonprofit organization founded in 1975 with a mission of fostering dialogue and advancing education to promote the wise use of our coastal resources. You can learn more about TCS and become a member at www.thecoastalsociety.org, shown on your screen right now. The Coastal Connection series is meant to better connect TCS members and guests from the coastal community throughout the year. Our intent is not just to be educated by our expert guest panelists, but also to see and hear from you, our other participants, during the Q&A session period that will follow later in the session. We encourage you to turn on your camera and share your questions and thoughts at that time once you are called upon. Note that we have scheduled a 1-hour session, but our presenters have agreed to remain online a bit longer if the conversation is flowing. Special thanks to Ashley Gordon and Melanie Perello for their support in organizing and running the session. In the spirit of connecting names and faces, especially for the sake of our TCS members on the line, I will quickly invite any members of the current TCS board joining us today to introduce themselves with their name, their location, their professional position and company, their day job if they've got one, and their favorite seafood. So I'll start by saying that I'm partial to scallops with a bit of butter and garlic and maybe some dill sprinkled on top. Ashley?
Thanks, Steve. Yes, hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Gordon, and I'm a coastal analyst with the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission located in Chesapeake, Virginia. And I would say I like many types of seafood, but I'm going to go with tuna poke for today.
Thank you. Tom?
I'm being attacked by a cat. I'm Tom Bigford. I'm a director on the board. I've been involved in the Coastal Society since 1976, so just after they started. My favorite seafood is seaweed. I like vegetable sushi, so seaweed was often associated with that.
Nice. Judy? You're on mute.
Yes, that I was. Thanks. I'm Judy Tucker, the Executive Director for the Coastal Society. So now you have a face with a name on an email. And I live in Williamsburg, Virginia. I think my favorite food is oysters any which way but fried.
Thanks. Jeff?
Hey folks, Jeff Flood. I'm a coastal planner with the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program based in Richmond, Virginia. And my favorite seafood is kind of a tie between oysters and scallops.
Great. Lisa?
Hi, everyone. Oops, sorry, got my video blocked. My name is Lisa Kim. I'm from around this area in the Maryland, Silver Spring, Maryland, and I'm the Congressional Affairs Specialist at NOAA's Office of Education. And I would say my favorite seafood is probably fish cakes.
Excellent. Are there any other current TCS board members that I missed on the line? Okay, well, very good. Without further ado, I am happy to introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Kelly Lucas. She is the Associate Vice President for Research, Coastal Operations, and Director of Thad Cochran Marine Aquaculture Center at the University of Southern Mississippi. She also serves on the board of Stronger America Through Seafood and recently served as the chair for the Gulf of Mexico University Research Collaborative. Prior to joining USM in December 2016, Dr. Lucas served as the first Chief Scientific Officer for the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources and served as Deputy Director of USM's Gulf Coast Geospatial Center. Dr. Lucas is a Mississippi Gulf Coast native and holds a PhD in coastal science from USM, an MBA from the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and a Bachelor of Science degree in microbiology from Mississippi State University. She has written and co-authored numerous scientific publications and has been instrumental in creating industry partnerships and securing grant funding. Please take it from here, Kelly.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate being here today, and I look forward to hearing the presentations as well as hearing your questions and hearing the discussion. Just a couple of items of logistics. We're going to proceed by having you raise your hands at the end of all, when, write your questions down. And when we get to the end of the question session, if you'll just raise your hand, we'll call on you. Additionally, you can also type your questions in the chat, but we certainly would like to hear you ask your questions of the panelists, right, to facilitate the discussion. So we do appreciate that. I'm going to continue with the seafood trend. I was thinking I was going to go with a finfish species as my favorite seafood, a triple tail, which is a Gulf of Mexico species, which is a quick growing species and growing in aquaculture potential. So I'm going to also ask our panelists to continue that trend, right, of telling us their favorite seafood. So I'm giving y'all a little heads up. Today, in terms of talking about aquaculture, right, we hear it called mariculture, fish farming, aqua farming, and it's the breeding and the rearing, harvesting of fish, shellfish, plants, and other organisms in water environments. And I do believe that's a NOAA aquaculture definition there, Dave, that I've used just to set up the discussion, right? And we are kind of at this point now where the U.S. has a lot of opportunity to increase our domestic supply of safe, healthy local seafood. Right now, as production has increased, I'm sure you're going to hear from several of the panelists about how the production of fish has increased, right? Not really from wild capture fisheries, which has been stagnant, but from growing aquaculture around the world. And thus far, we have been able to keep up production-wise with demand. And a lot of that has been because of innovations that have helped increase production, whether it be vaccine or cage improvements or genetic related innovations. And so I'm sure we'll hear about some of those advancements that we've made in terms of just science in general, but as well as management. We're also going to hear from the farmer's perspective, as well as from a policy perspective, right? Because we need to be good stewards as we look to increase production. And we're talking about both, socially, economically, environmentally, right? Being good stewards of how we go about doing this. And so we look forward to hearing from you in these discussions. So to begin with today, our first discussion, our first panel discussion here, Dave O'Brien is Acting Director of NOAA Fisheries Office of Aquaculture. He joined the office in 2006, where he served initially as Program Coordinator and later as International Coordinator. Since 2012, he's been Deputy Director. He started his career at NOAA in 2000 as a John Knaus Marine Policy Fellow and served for 6 years within the NOAA Fisheries Office of Protected Resources, implementing listing and recovery provisions of the Endangered Species Act. A fisheries biologist by training, O'Brien worked for 2 years as an aquaculture extension agent as a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon, West Africa, prior to his graduate education. He has a master's in marine, estuarine, and environmental science from the University of Maryland and a BS in zoology from the University of Massachusetts. Please welcome David O'Brien.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to the Coastal Society for inviting me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about one of my favorite subjects, aquaculture. And that's a tough question, my favorite one. So many. I always go back and forth between two. I'll pick today's sablefish, otherwise known as black cod, in the Pacific Northwest and Southeast Canada. It is absolutely delicious. Highly recommend it in any form, sushi, sashimi, grilled. It's all great. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Present, share screen. And can everyone see that okay? And could I get a audible confirmation so I can't see anybody?
Yes.
Yes.
You might
Great.
start the
Thank you.
presentation mode.
I'm sorry, what was that? It is showing on my screen as presentation mode.
Right now, we're seeing your PowerPoint with the sidebar with the smaller slides.
Sorry, that has happened before. I don't know why. That's still the case?
Yes.
Yes.
It is, but I bet we can survive.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure. It's showing up. Yeah, I'm not familiar with this format, so hopefully this is okay. It's mostly, I don't have too much text anyway. So anyway, I'm here today to talk, to sort of kick things off, first of all, with a great panel and Kelly moderating. I could have spoken about any wide numbers of things about aquaculture, but what I want to focus on today is how NOAA is using its science to foster sustainable marine aquaculture. We get an awful lot of questions about the sustainability generally of aquaculture and basically what kind of tools are in the toolbox for us to ensure that aquaculture develops in a sustainable fashion. And the bottom line up front, we do have quite a few tools in our toolbox. We're developing more, need to refine them, but we have quite a few options to make sure that aquaculture it currently is functioning in a sustainable way and will continue to do so as the industry evolves and expands. So since I'm kicking things off, I wanted to start with some broad context for everyone. This graphic is one I show a lot in my presentations. It's from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. It shows so graphically what Kelly mentioned at the beginning. That orange section is wild fish harvest. You can see it's been essentially flat since the mid-1980s at roughly 90 million metric tons. We're basically at or very close to sustainable yield globally and domestically as well from our wild fish. We can maybe tweak around the edges a little bit, but we're not going to get much more sustainable harvest. So really the only way to grow more seafood is to grow more seafood in farms. And you can see those blue wedges there are the aquaculture development that's taken place. This is through 2018 data. It's continued to go up since then. And again, this is globally.
I apologize for interrupting you, but we are having problems. The slides are not flipping, right? So we're still seeing your first slide.
Oh, okay. Then maybe it's time to go to the backup plan. I sent my slides to Coastal Society just in case it was a glitch.
Yes,
I said that
no
and
problem.
it just changed. I don't know if it's just a time delay or what may be going on, but
yeah,
I can go ahead and try.
Yeah.
Let me stop sharing my screen.
Okay, I'll go ahead and try to pull them up and see if we can get it to progress there.
Well, just while you're pulling it up, I can sort of talk through and, oh, great. Well, I can see that. Hopefully it's better for everyone else.
There we go. Okay.
Thank you. And I appreciate you interrupting. I hate to be just talking from my title screen the whole time. So there's the graphic I was talking about. Again, that orange section is wild fish, showing it's been stagnant essentially since for several decades. And those blue wedges are the aquaculture development, both marine and freshwater since that time. So right now, aquaculture makes up about half the world's seafood supply. And that's going to continue. We can see just continuing these trends out, aquaculture, it's already actually a bit more than half. It's projected to be around 2/3 of the seafood supply in the coming decade or so. So aquaculture is already and will continue to be an increasingly critical part of the global seafood supply. Next slide, please. So driving progress, what are you looking at in the future, essentially? We know that for a number of reasons, which we don't get into now, we're going to need, this comes from, I believe, World Bank, I believe, is the source of some of these data. We'll need another 40 million metric tons in 20 years. Now, keep in mind, total fisheries harvest right now globally is about 90 million metric tons. So this is a substantial amount of projected seafood demand. Part of that is being driven by nutritional guidelines. In our country, we don't generally eat as much seafood as other countries. We're being told roughly to double our seafood consumption for the health benefits, omega-3 fatty acids, as well as many micronutrients that come from seafood. It's basically a very healthy protein across the board, regardless of the species you're talking about. And of course, kelp as well. It's not just the proteins, the sea vegetables. There's interest in creating jobs. And I think this has always been one of our key drivers, but even more so over the past year and a half, as we've seen a lot of jobs go away. And we're looking at how to build back better, to use the administration's phrasing. There's a lot of job opportunities in coastal communities where they've been really decimated really in the past, slowly but surely over the decades as fisheries quotas have been steadily tightens to turn the corner on overfishing, for example. So there's a lot of opportunities for job growth and economic opportunity through aquaculture. And then seafood security and broadly, growing more at home. We import at least 70% of our seafood, and about half of that is imported from farms from around the country. So just from purely an environmental standpoint, there's an argument to be made, and we make the argument that if we're going to be eating farmed fish, as we will, and we do a lot, why not grow it locally under our own regulations in our own backyard, at least regionally, and reduced carbon footprint that comes along with that. And lastly, but certainly not least, we currently have almost $17 billion seafood trade deficit. And to put that in context, I think the total seafood trade deficit for the United States, the whole total trade deficit is in the ballpark of $70 billion. So this is a significant chunk. Next slide, please. This slide takes a little explanation, but it shows where the U.S. stands in terms of aquaculture production. The countries are ranked from top to bottom, top 1 through 17. We are number 17 there at the bottom. The little red dots are actually fish. If you see a bigger picture, you'd see the actual fish. That shows the sort of in cartoon form, the production levels of each country. And then the orange and blue bars represent the the land and water area available of each of those countries. So it kind of shows the potential and the actual growth of aquaculture. China is by far the biggest player. Other Asian countries round out the top few. And then we rank number 17. We have the largest ocean area in the world, as you can see from that large blue bar at the very bottom. And we're number 17th production, behind some much smaller countries. So what this tells us, one of the things this tells us, is there's a lot of untapped potential in the United States. As long as we can do aquaculture well and do it sustainably, there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of space to grow it in. Next slide, please. And this, I just want to pull out some text. I don't like putting a lot of text in my presentations, but I think there's some quotes here I wanted to highlight. These come from a publication that came out last year, international publication. It was led and drafted in part by Dr. Jane Levchenko. This is a high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy. They did a series of blue papers. And for those who don't know, Dr. Levchenko she led NOAA under the Obama administration. She's currently a very senior in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House in the Biden administration. World-renowned scientist and environmentalist. And here's some of the quotes that she and her colleagues came up with about aquaculture. That the ocean plays an important role in global food provision, has the potential to play a much more significant role through increased mariculture. And mariculture is just marine aquaculture. Under optimistic projections, the ocean could supply over 6 times more food than it does today. And then the last bullet gets to the question of finfish, which comes up a lot. As a form of fed mariculture, as opposed to filter feeders. Significantly expanding fed mariculture in a sustainable way is possible, but will require major innovations in feed, so production is not limited by captured fisheries. I say this in part because this is quite different from what we often see in the press. There's a broad and growing recognition amongst the environmental community. I would put Dr. Levchenko in that camp. That aquaculture, including finfish, can be done sustainably. We need to be careful. There's certainly some problems that could happen. We need to use our best tools and our best management to ensure that things happen in a good way. But sometimes we read in the press that all aquaculture, especially finfish, is just inherently unsustainable. And that is frankly not true, at least not the way it's done in this country. Next slide, please. Which gets me to really with the main point of my presentation. We get a number of questions, probably 8 or 10 questions on a regular basis about sustainable aquaculture practices. I don't have time to get into all of them today, but I just picked a few. These are probably more than half the ones we get on a regular basis. And I want to say just one slide each, what the challenge is and what NOAA, not just NOAA, our colleagues and other federal agencies, state agencies, academic and other partners, what we've sort of collectively done to help address them. We have questions about siting, fish feeds, water quality and benthic potential impacts, impacts from escapes, and then lastly, ecosystem services. And this more broadly sort of what kind of habitat is provided essentially through aquaculture operations and how it compares to wild habitats. So one slide each. Let's go to the next slide, please, starting with sighting. So our partners at the Ocean Service have put together a number of very impressive tools to look at sighting. Sighting is using GIS analysis, taking every data layer they can get their hands on, from biological data like presence of endangered species, that sort of thing, presence of oil rigs, military bases, fishing grounds, currents and depths, and put it together in a variety of packages to show where there may be more or less suitable areas for aquaculture based on proposed criteria. Ocean Reports is one you can go to online. It's been described as the Zillow of the ocean. It kind of gives, in a broad sense, the sort of the ocean neighborhood, what those parameters are, what that area may look like. This got a lot of attention a few years ago. It's been used widely. It's a great starting point for anyone who wants to do anything in the ocean, including aquaculture, but it's actually designed initially for wind energy. There's more detailed versions as well. And in fact, our friends at the Ocean Service are right now developing very detailed atlases to look at two new aquaculture opportunity areas, one in Southern California, one in the Gulf of Mexico. It's going to start with good sighting to try to avoid those user conflicts as much as possible, avoid those environmental impacts at that level as much as possible, right off the bat, through good sighting. I won't say anything more about aquaculture opportunity areas right now. It's probably more than I have time to get into, but sighting, it all starts with good sighting. Next slide, please. Feeds is an interesting one. We get a lot of questions, a lot of concerns about fish feeds, and it's one of the greatest success stories I can think of in aquaculture over the past 20 years or so. Let's start with the bottom left graphic there. This is data, it only goes through 2015. We don't have the 2020 data yet. But what it shows is that the average, that's a sort of a typical diet. It's, there's a wide range here, but it's a typical diet of salmon in red, other marine fish in blue, and shrimp in the orange, and how the percentage of fish meal and fish oil has declined over time in those diets, starting at, for salmon, up close to 75% back in the mid-90s, now down to less than 20%, about 25%. And that trend has continued, and there's actually some experimental diets right now, but they're completely vegetarian. So you hear some concerns at times about, let's not feed fish to fish. You could argue that on a variety of levels, but the point is here that we're not feeding a lot of fish to fish, or increasingly less so. These species are carnivorous in the wild. It doesn't mean they have to be in captivity. As long as they get the right balance of amino acids and other nutrients, we can put together a feed that works quite well from a variety of ingredients. Which leads me to those slides, those pictures on the right-hand side. In the lower right is soy. That has been and continues to be a major contributor to fish feeds and other animal feeds for that matter, and human feeds for that matter. But also that middle graphic is one of black soldier fly, which their larvae are actually high in protein. And so that's actually a black soldier fly farm. There's a lot of interest in that species and other insect species and worms and a variety of other things that are being used very creatively to go into finfish diets and other animal diets as well. And then lastly, at the top, those are fish heads. And this is another interesting and very positive development, that much of the fish meal and fish oil that we do need for aquaculture now is increasingly coming from what used to be discarded waste product, the fish heads, the tails, the guts from seafood processing plants. So the total fish meal and fish oil going into these feeds has declined, and it increasingly is coming from these fish trimmings. So again, there's more room to grow there and to improve, but it's been a great success story and one that's not told enough. Next slide, please. Two other topics are water quality and escapes. Starting with water quality and benthic impacts as well. We've developed at NOAA and with partners around the world a variety of tools to be able to predict and avoid, say, water quality impacts. Just as an example, people may have heard about a farm proposed off of Sarasota, well, about 45 miles off of Sarasota. The pilot project, we worked with the EPA, which has a management authority over water quality in federal waters, to look at, run simulation models to figure out what the impact of that farm would be. Bottom line is it's extremely small. In fact, I don't have it in front of me, but as I recall, within 30 or 40 meters of the cage, they predict no measurable impact at all, let alone a significant one. So we're working with the EPA on, we've been working up for quite some time, sort of on a case-by-case basis, but we're trying to solidify that through a more developed partnership to work with them so that our water quality models can feed more smoothly into their management authorities and needs for permitting. On a similar vein for escapes, we had a lot of questions about escapes. First and foremost, we had a policy going back to 2011 to, under almost every situation, to only allow for, to the extent we have this authority, native and naturalized species. And there's no reason right now to not do that. Everyone I know of who's working on aquaculture and industry wants to try to grow species that are native to the area for a variety of reasons. So starting with that, it really minimizes the potential escape impact. But then beyond that, there are potential impacts from genetic pollution, essentially, if you have domesticated fish escaping. But we have good models now. Actually, we've had them for quite some time, developed out of our Northwest Fisheries Science Center, to be able to evaluate, those potential genetic impacts based on basically the relative distance between the wild population and the farmed population genetically, the presumed amount of sort of leakage, as it's called, and a variety of other factors. But we have ways to predict what those impacts could be. And then we're having more and more opportunities for sterilization as well, so that even if fish do escape, there's ways to reduce their success in the wild. So between these tools and the management flexibility that comes with them, and we have if any permit is issued and we find for whatever reason the assumptions going to that permit are wrong, that we find through monitoring, through evaluation, we can go and do an adaptive management approach and work with our federal partners and the industry to make adjustments. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one I have, and this is sort of the flip side of these other pieces. We're really showing, trying to address concerns. In this case, we're also looking at what ecosystem services are provided by some types of aquaculture. The seaweed down the bottom, we know it absorbs a lot of carbon. In fact, there's a lot of interest now in could we use large seaweed farms as a carbon sequestration device to really help with climate change impacts on a large scale. Department of Energy is also looking at kelp as a biofuel, but they have a lot of local impacts as well. They've been shown to have, at least in a very local level, a buffering impact against climate change, against ocean acidification. And then up top right, that's an oyster farm, and just with GoPro cameras that some of our science centers are using, we're just trying to show, first of all, that look, there's a lot of animals that use these farms as habitat, as structure. They feed off the biofouling on them, use them as refuges, just like they would any other structure. So we're trying to quantify that more and evaluate the relative habitat benefits of, say, an oyster farm versus an oyster reef, that sort of thing. And I believe that's my last slide, but just click one more time, please. That is. So anyway, I appreciate the chances. I know I ran through a lot of stuff quickly. I could have gone on for a lot longer. I hope it didn't go over time. But happy to answer. I'm not sure, Kelly, if you want to have questions now or just wait till the end. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And we're just going to save our questions for the end. So if you have a question and you know you have it for Dave, just go ahead and jot it down, and we can ask those at the end. Next up, we have Paul Zajicek. So Paul is the Executive Director of the National Aquaculture Association. And the NAA was formed by commercial aquaculturists in 1991 to advocate for U.S. aquaculture and provide science-based information describing U.S. aquaculture. Paul served with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services for 27 years in marketing and regulatory roles, culminating in managing Florida's one-stop shop for aquaculture regulation. He was a longtime NAA member and joined the NAA staff on a full-time basis in November of 2014. He earned his BS in marine biology from Florida Tech and a master's in agriculture from the University of Florida. Welcome, Paul, and don't forget to tell us your favorite seafood.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Can people see my presentation before I answer that question? Is the screen share working?
I don't see.
Is the screen share?
No.
Okay. So I was hoping to make this work. Let's see. Well, Not sure what the problem is.
Paul, are you seeing your share screen icon at the bottom of the Zoom
Yeah,
window?
it's just not showing me a choice for the, which it did before. Let's try this. How's that? Anything?
It says you've started it, and there you go.
All right, very good. All right, so we have the first slide now, Kelly.
It is in, there we go.
Okay, very good. It's very slow. So to answer your question about the favorite seafood, I like just about anything that comes out of the ocean or out of a pond. But I do remember taking a very beautiful young lady to dinner one night. I can't remember her name, but I can tell you I had pompano with almonds, and it was just fantastic. So I guess that tells you where my love really lies. So the National Aquaculture Association, we were formed by farmers in 1991. I have a 22-member board of directors that are from Maine to Washington State to Texas to Florida, all around the country, wherever there's aquaculture. I have 15 different technical committees that really do the work of the association. I just kind of plug the cords into the right spot, and they produce all the policy statements and that sort of thing. So it's been quite a pleasure to work for them. And their goal fundamentally is to advocate for U.S. aquaculture at the national level. So what is our goal for U.S. aquaculture overall? And I would say pretty clearly that we'd really like to join the ranks of countries that are producing seafood to meet the challenge of protein into 2050 for that 9 billion people we're going to see. And we've been at this for a while in the United States, probably since about the 1870s, growing fish, but we are way far behind the rest of the world, as David so ably presented. We import somewhere, there's an argument over this, somewhere between 65 and 90% of the seafood produced in the United States. And we have very limited, in the grand scheme of things, very limited marine fish production, limited shrimp production, and limited seaweed production in the US. And it's scattered in inland states and coastal states. The shellfish production is doing well and growing in our coastal states. And many people may wonder, well, why is that? You're the Coastal Society. Why don't we see greater production in the US? Well, it's pretty simple. It's the greater cost of production in the United States, and the fact that we have a very hard time because of those greater costs of production to compete against the huge flood of seafood that enters into the United States. Currently, we have no marine aquaculture production in federal waters, although there's a variety of groups that are applying for the operational permits to do that. And we'll talk a little bit later about why that's pretty hard for them to get where they want to go. So the seafood snapshot is what kind of drives a lot of interest by people that are inside and outside aquaculture to get into the business or hopefully expand their businesses. And you'll notice there's a lot of B's and billions in here, except for about the middle of the line there where it shows U.S. aquaculture at 625 million pounds. And that's not just the marine side, that's freshwater and marine. So you can really see, you know, in all those B's, we're a very small proportion. But there's great promise here. On a per capita basis, the United States, we eat about 16 pounds per capita of seafood. Not so true in coastal states. For Florida, it could be twice that amount because some of these coastal states, like where I live, really love their seafood. And nutritionists really are encouraging us to eat 2 servings per week, which would be 26 pounds a year. But who's doing that? Maybe 10 to 20% of Americans. But let's not look at this on a negative. Let's look at this positively. We have a great way to go. As people start to eat more and more seafood, we saw an upswing during the COVID pandemic. People really started eating seafood at home, which they hadn't in the past. And so we really have all the way to go forward. This is kind of an up picture. So they were sort of asked to talk about how we produce seafood in the United States. Well, that's a couple-day dissertation. So I'm just going to throw some pictures up on on the wall here. We have a great variety of gear that's either produced in the United States or produced in the United States and sold in other countries to grow seafood. In the variety of products David's already touched on, so I'll just mention the great innovations that are occurring in these farms to try to reduce costs. So I don't know if you can see my little arrow, but this little picture in the middle of the screen, that's actually a Manila clam farm in the Puget Sound area. And that's a tulip bulb harvester that's been adapted to harvest Manila clams. So now there's the two gentlemen are literally harvesting a whole bunch of Manila clams to reduce labor costs and increase the efficiency of their farm, versus gentlemen in the bottom corner here where there's two guys that are harvesting bag at a time. Now that's not to say that's not an improvement over how oysters are grown, but you can really see the difference that can occur as automation is adopted within U.S. aquaculture, and that's being one of the pursuits that's occurring. Kind of another interesting adaptation is we have this little white boat here in the middle. That's called a bird dog. It's a real traditional mullet skiff that was used throughout the Gulf Coast. This is kind of an oversized one that the farmers have adapted to shellfish production. These boats are really kind of cool because the motor is up front and the tiller is up front. And so this leaves the whole back of the boat as an open work platform. And bird dogs typically did not, they all had sterns on them because they were gillnet skiffs. This particular design, they've taken the stern out, so now they can slide their gear in and out of the boat very easily. There's generally water pumps on board so they can clean out the mud and sediments that accumulates in that shellfish, and it just washes back over and back onto the leash. More recently, there's been a real surge in interest in shellfish production because of surface running gear to grow oysters that really came out of Australia. And I was on a farm a couple farms actually last week, where we worked with several different kinds of the surface running gear. It really produces a great clean product, a nicely deeply cupped oyster that people want to see on their plate. So I'm not going to talk about every picture, but I just wanted to give you a sense of sort of the diversity of gear that's out there and some of the innovation that's occurring. So being a farmer also takes guts. Talking about risk here. Here's our good old buddy Karenia brevi up here in the top, a red tide. So hazardous algal blooms are a big threat to both finfish and marine and shellfish production. Storms in a variety of forms and intensities can really rip up a farm, so that's a risk for us. Predators, cow nose rays. Many of you may be familiar with the cow nose rays. They just love mollusks, and when they figure out there's a farm there, they're going to do anything they can to eat them. And so there's a lot of innovation to prevent the cow nose ray and blue crab from tearing things up. And then, of course, we have people. So we've had commercial vessels go steaming through lease areas and tear up gear. Not that particular boat. If that's your granddad's shrimp boat, he was not the problem. We've had people do that. Some recreational boaters aren't very alert on the water sometimes, or the kinds of fishing gear that they use will entangle with existing gear. So they can be kind of an issue too, although the farmers like to work with recreational fishers. A lot of fish are attracted by lease operations. And then last but not least, I think a very telling risk for our society as a whole is litigation. So our farmers are in the courtroom and their permits are being challenged. Society has the opportunity to do so. That's a great thing here in the United States, but it is a risk to farms. The farm that David mentioned, the experimental farm out in the Gulf of Mexico, its parent permit is currently being appealed administratively by two different environmental groups. And I'm not really sure when that appeal will be resolved. So then we have the gasp in this. There's about 20 federal acts that impinge upon aquaculture in some way, shape, or form. I've highlighted in blue some of those that you may be more familiar with and what we think about, but the other ones in white are out there. They influence how we farm, where we farm, what we can use on our farms. And it's quite a gauntlet to thread. And this does drive up costs. The National Aquaculture Association has been strongly supporting some independent analysis by economists about exactly what regulations cost the farmer, both the inland farmer and the coastal farmer. Those papers, they're all peer-reviewed, published papers that they finished so far, posted to our website. But this regulatory environment, which we prize so much because it's a good thing, really, it is very costly to the farmer. And a couple of acts that I've highlighted in red, I think most people don't think about really or realize that they're there. The Lacey Act from 1900 was really developed to moderate hunting and prevent overhunting in different parts of the country where people were playing a shell game with state regulations. But a part of the Lacey Act is exactly that. I mean, it's expanded and changed over time, that it backs up other federal laws, state laws, tribal laws, and even foreign law. That if you're in international trade or interstate trade and you are breaking the law in one state or in another country and you're caught at it, you're liable to federal prosecution. And the punishments in Lacey are frankly quite off the charts. I've had criminal lawyers tell me that they didn't realize the criminal punishment associated with Lacey. It rivals and exceeds some of the criminal statutes. And in many times when you have an Endangered Species Act violation, federal prosecutors will actually turn to the Lacey Act and use that act's criminal penalties rather than the ESA. Another act that's really kind of interesting, and I think we actually as citizens should prize, is the National Environmental Policy Act. So when federal permits are proposed that have a real significance, then this kicks in the National Environmental Policy Act to bring in other agencies and their authorities so that the right hand does know what the left hand is doing. And those agencies can influence the provisions in those permits. So we have a pretty good provision, we have pretty good federal framework in the United States. We think it does an excellent job. We really don't see where there's holes in this framework. A lot of people think there is. I'm going to post in the chat box a link to the Ocean Era permit for that farm in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm going to put a little challenge to the audience here. Go through that permit, see if you can find any holes in it, because we would really like to know. We as the farming community think that the federal framework we currently have is more than adequate and enforced. It's not just words on paper, but there's actually the enforcement framework and the punishments to make it work and scare the bejesus out of most farmers. So I guess I kind of bled into this. We really think that the public and a lot of the critics really undervalue the regulations that we have. The Clean Water Act, as David mentioned, is all about discharge to surface waters. The River and Harbors Act, Section 10 permit, is all about structures. And when these permits are considered in federal waters, NEPA brings in all the other agencies. Excuse me, I used the acronym. The National Environmental Policy Act brings in all the other agencies to comment on those permits. And so the complexities, there we go with the NEPA, the designating a federal agency, and then the environmental impact analysis. So I think many people may not realize, maybe you in the Coastal Society do, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the applicant then has to reach out to a state and ask for a consultation on whether they're in congruence with the coastal laws. So that Ocean Era permit in the Gulf, they consulted with the state of Florida and they had to comply with 24 different federal statutes and show that they were in compliance. And then if you're not in federal waters, but you're in state waters, the federal framework provides this overall framework for the nation, but then state regulations are usually incongruence, or they're a delegated authority from the federal agency to the state, and they can always be more restrictive. State regulations can always be more restrictive, not less restrictive. And because in state waters for marine aquaculture, there's a property right that's granted, usually in the form of a lease, those lease provisions can have enforceable requirements. So we think the public really kind of undervalues the regulations that are out there. But as I mentioned earlier, we think they're pretty complete, pretty effective, and have plenty of teeth to them. So what are our current challenges as farmers? And I'm thinking mostly from the marine perspective. Well, this crosses all the boundaries of aquaculture. We really lack insurance as farms. There is property insurance, it's available, but it's really so cost prohibitive, it's just unaffordable. And there aren't many policies out there. There are workmen's insurance out there, workmen's comp, it's available, but it's also very expensive. And because of the Jones Act, it can be prohibitively expensive for coastal farms. Crop insurance is really a tough one. Recently, just within the last couple of months, the National Aquaculture Association worked politically and with the agencies to get, or with USDA, one agency, to get a catastrophic disaster crop insurance. But, you know, is that really what we should depend on as farmers? That there's always something there in a catastrophic situation? We don't think so. We really need improved insurance across the board here. And then for marine aquaculture in state waters, that's not so much of a problem for a property right. All the coastal states, 23 of them, offer some sort of a property right to marine aquaculture. So the farmers have an asset. They can go out and borrow money. They can get insured. They have this asset that people can go against. And so it's there, it's security of 10 years. All the other nations that farm offshore, they offer a property right, but there is no property right in federal waters. And while there's folks that are going after the operational permits, those permits are not an asset. And so they really have nothing to fall back on. I mean, it's wonderful that they're this kind of a level of a risk taker, but they really have no property asset going forward. And this is something to really be aware of and think about as we do as farmers. So going forward, we think there'll be continued growth in shellfish production. The U.S. is really not a huge shellfish consumer, but we're hoping that will change. We're working with the U.S. Risk Management Agency on crop insurance. There's a couple policies, products that they produced or endorsed for shellfish. We'd like to see one for finfish. Maybe I'm not explaining well enough here. So Risk Management Agency, they do not insure, but they back up policy products that meet their criteria. So we're working with RMA on that. I mentioned the risk takers for finfish production in federal waters. The leading edge is the bleeding edge, and that's where they are right now. And we really do anything we can to help them. But until there's a property right, we just don't think there'll be much production in federal waters. Dave sort of touched on the executive order, which really within current regulations and laws, kind of gave the agencies some marching orders. It created NOAA as a lead agency in federal waters to be that NEPA lead in organizing the consultation amongst the agencies. And then Dave mentioned the aquaculture opportunity areas. This is not going to streamline regulations, but what it'll really do for those risk takers is identify areas where they probably have least conflict with others. And then what we've really been waiting for is a regulatory guidance document that was in the EO that maybe will calm down people that have been hopping up and down that the regulations are just too complicated and need to be streamlined. We think, at least for the oceans, that we as society really prize that ocean environment. We don't think the regulations are too complicated. They are complicated and they are expensive, but as they should be for that kind of an environment. And then the other thing that we're watching is federal offshore legislation. The NAA has been commenting on versions since 2005. Congress still hasn't gotten it right. As far as we're concerned, there's been no property right proposed. Congress is the only body that has the authority to propose a property right or authorize a property right.
Hey, Paul, I'm not sure. We need to probably go ahead and move on to Drue's presentation in case some people need to drop off.
Okay, I'm done.
All righty, thank you. Next up, we have Drue Winters. Drue is a seasoned policy and strategic communications advisor with an expertise in disaster management, natural resources, ecosystem restoration, and fisheries. She joined the American Fisheries Society as policy director in May of 2017. She previously served in a key leadership role for Governor Bobby Jindal in Louisiana for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. She handled legal and policy matters on a range of fisheries issues for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Prior to her tenure with the state of Louisiana, she served as a key federal policy advisor on the long-term recovery of the Gulf Coast following Hurricane Katrina, with a focus on flood control, flood insurance, and ecosystem restoration. Thank you, Drue, and do tell us your favorite seafood before you get started.
Oh, thanks. You're asking a Louisiana girl to pick her favorite seafood. So if I really had to be pushed, it would be red snapper cooked on the half shell on the grill. But I could eat my weight in shrimp and crabs and blue crabs. And, you know, before I came to AFS, I knew a little bit about aquaculture, but I will tell you that I had a negative impression. You know, thinking about Louisiana's vibrant wild-caught fisheries, I thought, why do we need aquaculture? And honestly, I thought, yuck, all of the stuff that goes into aquaculture. But coming to AFS, which is the oldest and largest fisheries science society, who has a mission to conservation and sustainability of fisheries resources and aquatic ecosystems, had the opportunity to be educated on the science. And we've been taking that opportunity to bring some of that science to the Hill. So since I've been with AFS, I've learned the real story, some of which David talked about today. And I've put in our chat also some information on those advances in science and technology that have really changed the landscape in marine aquaculture, that have reduced the environmental footprint and led to the sustainability. So you might ask altogether, why is AFS paying attention to things like food security? Well, food production systems might be a little bit outside of the typical fisheries professional's wheelhouse, but how we feed ourselves has major implications for fish and fisheries. When we think of aquatic conservation, one of the most important variables is land use and how it impacts watersheds. We could feed 1 billion people more with more chicken, pork, and beef, but if we're going to do that, that means a lot more feedlots and acres in crop production, and that has consequences for fish. And it's not just land use. How we choose to produce animal protein also has implications for freshwater, greenhouse gas emissions, energy consumption, and so on, some of which you heard about today. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about everything I planned, but I want to cover a few things, particularly about how aquaculture can be a climate-friendly food and contribute to climate resilience. And talk a little bit about some of the anticipated impacts on wild capture fisheries from climate change. So next slide, please. Aquaculture is directly related to fisheries conservation, and aquaculture has a role in maintaining the tangible and intangible benefits that thriving fisheries provide. Last fall, AFS established a policy supporting offshore aquaculture in recognition of the interconnectedness of aquaculture and fisheries conservation, and the fact that modern aquaculture is driven by science and has evolved considerably in recent years. The environmental impacts of marine aquaculture have been substantially reduced through advances in science and technology that have changed the landscape when it comes to historical problems of water quality or benthic impacts, use of wild fish inputs and feed, escapement from marine fish farms, and fish health management issues, including the use of antibiotics and the advances in use of vaccines, some of which you've heard about today. Next slide. So again, we've got to feed a lot more people with a lot more protein, and we need a lot of that, 60% more animal protein by 2030. Up until the 90s, the vast majority of our seafood came from wild capture. More than 80% of global fish stocks are now considered fully exploited, in recovery from overfishing, or unfortunately in decline. And while US stocks are well managed, there's little additional room for sustainable wild capture. So where is all this seafood going to come from? Aquaculture has emerged to fill this growing seafood gap. And the question is whether this is going to happen in US waters or whether we will continue to get our seafood from places far and wide, along with the carbon footprint that accompanies that, and from places that don't always have the same stringent environmental safeguards that we have here in the US that I think Paul captured well in his discussion today. So agriculture, aquaculture, conservation, food, water, carbon footprints, climate change, All of these things are interconnected, and aquaculture matters in terms of putting food on the table, but also doing so without putting additional pressure on natural resources or the climate. Next slide, please. So let's talk about climate change for a moment. When people think about climate change, the images that are likely to come to mind are dry, cracked earth, the forest fires that are currently burning up the West, and the droughts, the superstorms, and the polar bear dancing on a melting iceberg. Those images come to mind in part because we can see and experience all of those things. But fish and fisheries are also being impacted by climate change right now. The combined effects of warming temperatures, low oxygen, acidification, predator and prey migration, and sea level rise threaten to reshuffle ecosystems and established fisheries. As sea levels rise, you know this, you guys are the Coastal Society, right? Coastal salt marshes retreat landward, but then that retreat is blocked by hardened shoreline structures, and we lose wetlands and marsh and what is known as the coastal squeeze. And that loss of habitat from sea level rise will lead to declines in the vast majority of commercially and recreationally harvested marine finfish and shellfish that are dependent on these estuaries and coastal systems for some stage of their life cycle. Ocean acidification is causing numerous problems. As seawater absorbs carbon dioxide, it becomes increasingly corrosive. Species such as urchins, oysters, and scallops with calcified shells, as well as fish like salmon that rely on these calcifiers for food, are at risk from this changing ocean chemistry. Coral made of calcium carbonate is also highly sensitive to ocean acidification and warming, putting this very valuable marine habitat at risk. Harmful algal blooms are sucking the oxygen out of affected systems. They also produce toxins that can harm aquatic life. And dead zones and HABs are occurring more frequently and are becoming larger and more persistent. Obviously, if the oxygen levels drop too low, major mortality events can occur. And of course, we know that fish stocks are shifting to avoid these kinds of problems, like Atlantic cod that are moving north into deeper waters in search of cooler temperatures. But even when circumstances aren't quite so dire as to kill fish outright or to cause populations to move, that doesn't mean fisheries aren't being affected. When fish are forced to cope with this impaired environmental conditions, they have to expend energy that they could otherwise use to forage for food, avoid predators, or invest in reproduction. And they use that energy just to stay alive in these climate change conditions. Ultimately, this means smaller, less robust fish, reduced recruitment, and populations that are more vulnerable to any number of threats. And no food production system is immune from climate, but there also are some scientific advances that allow for some mitigation and adaptation in the aquaculture context that can make this make marine aquaculture a more climate friendly and resilient food system. So next slide, please. So again, the statistic was mentioned already that half of the seafood Americans consume is farm raised and 60 to 90% of that is imported. And that leaves a sizable carbon footprint as that seafood travels around the world before it ends up on our plates. Increasingly, scientists are calling for food production to shift towards seafood, which is often more climate friendly than other sources of animal protein. Food from the sea produced using best practices can have some of the lowest greenhouse gas emissions per unit of protein produced of all animal protein sources. And relative to other types of animal agriculture, marine aquaculture has lower feed use, less water use, and less land use. Moreover, seafood's carbon footprint is primarily affected by fuel consumption. So seafood that's air freighted is 3 to 5 times more carbon intensive than highway freight and 31 times higher than sea-based freight. The distance from processing increases that carbon footprint. So shipping seafood from another country and then importing it back for sale can skyrocket fuel and energy consumption, leading to higher emissions rates. So think about something like European sea bass, branzino, that's featured here. It's grown in open ocean pens in the Mediterranean. And in 2017, 13 million pounds was flown 7,000 miles from Greece and Turkey to the US. If we grew striped bass, white sea bass, or other hybrids in US waters, we could greatly reduce this carbon footprint simply by growing this here. So also think about the benefits of kelp and bivalve farming, some of which was discussed here already today, in terms of improving water quality, regulating ocean acidification, storing carbon, protecting coastlines, and providing habitat for other species, which can help marine ecosystems be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So of course, aquaculture cannot fully realize its potential if we don't foster its growth. So Paul talked a little bit about the regulatory process and the environmental process. So let's just talk about the permitting side, actually getting a farm in the ground. So it currently takes years and years to get a permit for an offshore aquaculture farm. The process is long, expensive, and sometimes uncertain, not ever really knowing which agency is the right one, things bouncing between different agencies. And that uncertainty will lead farmers to take their investment elsewhere, and the US aquaculture technology along with it. So Don Kent from Hub SeaWorld recently spoke at a briefing that we did on the Hill, talked about his challenges in getting a farm on the ground, the technology that they were developing to produce their juvenile fish in the lab for grow out. And ultimately that went to Mexico. The technology, he doesn't ship fish to Mexico. They grow their own juvenile fish and they grow them out there, and that gets shipped back to the US. So it is very clear that marine aquaculture cannot develop in this country without a predictable and stable regulatory pathway. And a ruling, I think it was in 2018, in US Federal District Court case about NOAA's authority to regulate marine aquaculture via the Magnuson-Stevens Act. The court ruled that NOAA did not have authority under MSA to regulate aquaculture, and that made need for congressional action even more critical. So in the last couple of years, bills have been introduced in Congress to establish just this type of clear regulatory pathway. I think Paul mentioned that the NAA has had some challenges with the property right issue in that. That act is called the Advancing the Quality and Understanding of American Aquaculture Act, or the Aqua Act. It's been introduced in both in the House and the Senate in those in the last couple of Congresses, and those bills have made little progress. Now, AFS does not take positions on specific pieces of legislation, and we don't have a position on the Aqua Act, but we support the concept, and we have been engaged in educating policymakers on some of the advances in science and technology that we talked about here today. So that lack of understanding of the science, or perhaps an unwillingness to embrace these advances in science, has been a major impediment to progress. We often talk with congressional staff about this, and they're like, well, there's some science we don't know. There's some more science we need to know. And that really hasn't been identified to us what that is. And so we do anticipate that a bill will be introduced in the Senate at some point in this Congress. And I urge you as the Coastal Society and as individuals here to consider how you can be involved in this dialogue. So we believe that we don't have to choose between thriving fisheries and sustainable aquaculture. Fisheries and aquaculture readily coexist, and we feel like, in fact, it must do so if we are to feed ourselves and fulfill our commitments to conservation and climate resilience. Properly executed aquaculture paired with a sustainable capture fisheries has the potential to increase food security, sequester carbon, decrease the carbon footprint of protein sources, and stimulate economic activity in both coastal and inland communities. And happy to chat further if you have any questions about how you can get involved or help share the science on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Drue. And thanks to all of our panelists. So first round of questions, go to those who raised their hand. And Kara, I don't know if you're clapping or if you're raising your hand for a question, but if you want to use an icon, right? One of the reactions, or raise your hand, or however it works. If you put something there, I'm going to assume you have a question. All righty. So there is hold on. All right, Steve.
Yeah, I'm wondering one question that has come up before is the certification process. You talk about a lot of imports, and is there a method or a process? What's the best way for a consumer to identify sustainably raised aquaculture fish products?
Well, I don't mind taking a stab at that one. Maybe Kelly or Paul or someone else or Drue may have other thoughts on this. So, I mean, first of all, a lot of folks would say, and I would be one of them, that anything raised in the United States or caught in the United States is by definition sustainable. So I think anything of country of origin, US, it's gone through the gamut of regulations, the permits, whatever, whether it be wild or farmed, they can feel quite confident eating that food. I would not to say other countries are not good as well, but I think the challenge there is we don't always know exactly what's happening in other countries. And there is a role here for third-party certification. That's where I think a lot of consumers go to. And there's a range of metrics they use. I think probably the most widely known one is Monterey Bay Aquarium, but there's MSC, there's others, or even Whole Foods, for example, has essentially their own kind of certification program. So there's a wide range of them, and I think it's and Paul may have thoughts on this from the industry perspective. I know certainly we hear from industry at times that there were sort of fewer options out there because each one of these certification schemes costs money to engage with.
So eco labels, there's a variety of them. Really, the business model is to create for the U.S. consumer some sense of assurance that those foods are sustainably produced or produced to the same standards as U.S. production. For the corporate buyers, it's an easy way in for them to declare sustainability by adopting a label, and they then require all their providers, suppliers to use that label. From our perspective as a U.S. grower, and then we have two standards to meet: the regulations of the United States, which are costly, and then these labels are not inexpensive. They're entirely borne by the farm. The buy-in is in tens of thousands of dollars to acquire a label, and then all the auditing that occurs to certify that label, those costs are borne by the farmer. And so for the farming community, it's almost like extortion. The big corporate buyers, they don't have any costs. We're just going to require a label. And if we're going to sell to those buyers, then we have to pay the piper twice, essentially, to get into that market. I agree with David that if you think of any of the Western countries like Canada, the United States, European countries, there's a country of origin labeling requirement in the United States. So when you're in your store, you can see exactly where that seafood comes from, unless it's been processed. Then that label disappears. But you can ask your provider, where does this seafood come from? And that's essentially what the wife asked me. I do all the cooking. So she calls and say, hey, there's a special on grouper here and it's from XYZ. What do you think? And I'll either say yay or nay. Most of the time grouper, not a problem, but for other projects, she does have a lot of questions. I think us as consumers, just generally in the United States, we really trust where we go and buy, whether it's a restaurant or a retail store, that they're carrying good products. And that's kind of a good thing in a way. I mean, we have trust in the supply of food that we have. It's remarkably cheap on the world stage. We have huge diversity of food. It's available to us. And in fact, in many respects, because we're really not starving in this country, there's really not this push to go offshore and fish, or to farm. There's not that need. We think coming down the pike, there will be that need. And working with the Congress, as Drue mentioned, on the legislation. The legislation has gotten pretty complicated. It requires more regulatory requirements that we think are necessary, and there is no property right. And these farms are remarkably productive. A very small footprint can produce just a tremendous amount of seafood. So the concerns of a lot of people about environmental impacts, if you really step back and examine all the different production systems and look at offshore, probably offshore is one of the least environmentally impactful of any production system out there. And when I say that, everybody's going to go, oh, that can't be true. Well, dig into it, and I think you'll find it is true.
All righty. Additional questions? There is one in the chat box, Drue, for you, and it's in regards to conflicting scientific studies and how people can trust the science about the same subjects, right? Even though they're conflicting. What advice would you provide to people in that. And you can see a little bit more in the chat box, but
yeah, I mean, I read that and I'm not sure exactly what to do about that. So, you know, AFS is a science society. We produce peer-reviewed publications. We've got journals and we've got a monthly magazine that is a hybrid of both articles and peer-reviewed publications. And we have scientists that I have trust in that aren't just industry scientists, that some work for NOAA. We have, you know, a past president of AFS who has been involved in this, who is now in industry, but previously worked in state service and, you know, worked for state fish and wildlife agencies. And they have published research, which, you know, I can send it to you. And so that's the science I believe, right? That's the peer-reviewed published literature by a variety of sciences. I don't know what you're talking about exactly, because I haven't seen science that says all of these negative impacts on the environment. Everything that has been communicated to me, and again, I'm not a scientist, right? I am a policy person, and I take the science, working with the scientists to present the best available science to policymakers. And I hope you don't think I was trying to misrepresent anything to you today, right? So I read the publications, I work with the scientists, and then we deliver that information and we share that science. So if there's something particular that you've seen that you want me to look at, that you think is industry funded and that you don't trust, I'm happy to look at it. But what we have presented to congressional staff is the advances in feed and the advances in siting that have really reduced those water quality impacts, and sort of the real story on escapes and their ability to sort of thrive and grow outside of a farm if there is an escape situation, and how that's, you know, really minimal. We've even you know, had an opportunity to look at some of the big escapes that have garnered a lot of media attention, and sort of debunk the truth of some of that, because a lot of what you're seeing in the media is not the truth. So please feel free to share that information with me. I would love to see it and know exactly what you're talking about. We have a whole fish culture section made of aquaculture practitioners, not necessarily marine aquaculture practitioners, but aquaculture scientists. And we'd love to look at that if there's something particular that is contrary to what I've seen and what we've been presenting on. And I would love to evaluate that.
So many of the criticisms that are leveled against U.S. aquaculture are based on events and situations in other countries. And it's not the U.S. regulatory framework. I think when I was first approached about this, Melanie may have said, maybe you want to talk about the Seaspiracy film. Well, the Seaspiracy film, pretty good piece of entertainment. But if you'll notice, there is no mention of the United States. The producers and the reporter had to travel all over the world to find all kinds of situations that are pretty darn alarming, and they presented them in the most dramatic fashion possible. But it wasn't here. So pat yourselves on the back. You as citizens of the country are supporting a regulatory framework and an educational system that's producing farmers and regulators and policymakers that are pretty smart and are making wise decisions and are protecting the environment. I noticed in Fidel's comment, he said that the industry pays for some of this research. I can tell you, we don't have the money to do that. So I'd like to see some examples. I mean, it's an easy thing to say, but send me those examples and we'll talk about it, and we'll share information. We've decided as an association to take independent research, published research that we didn't have a hand in, and summarize it to refute some of these criticisms, myths and criticisms. I've posted the link in the chat box. And where you find fault with that, I want to hear about it. This is not an association that's interested in presenting false information. I have board members from PhDs down to farmers that have been at this for 4 generations in the United States. And they go to the same schools that you did. They heard all the same lessons. They took that to heart, that we want to be great environmental stewards, and that's the American farmer.
Thanks. And so I saw Drue posted her email, and Paul, you can post your email too. Fidel said he'd send that information. And thanks, Noelle. She has a question here. And it's in regards to current efforts to get commercial fishermen, right, that are struggling into aquaculture. And I know of several examples, but I'm going to let our panelists speak first about efforts they know around the country of getting commercial fishermen engaged in aquaculture.
I can start. Certainly, there's been a number of efforts over the years. And actually, Kelly may be more up to speed on the current ones than I am, but there's through the Sea Grant program in particular, they fund a lot of grant work for some of the research that was just discussed. But also they do a lot of extension work. They do workforce development, training. They had some very successful efforts historically. In fact, it was some of the clam farming in Florida was really started from displaced fishermen when they instituted the gillnet ban. I forget how long ago that was now, quite some time ago. And so they work quite closely there. They've also funded some work up in Maine, trying to get fishermen involved in finfish culture, both cod as well as steelhead. So there are things like that out there. And I would say that along these same lines, I think historically, and still to a certain extent, there's been a bit of a butting of heads between the commercial fishing industry and aquaculture. That still definitely exists in some areas, but that's breaking down to a large extent, and especially in places like Maine, where if you look at some of most of the folks getting into aquaculture now come from fishing families, the sons and daughters of fishermen. There's a lot more synergy and complementarity between wild fish and aquaculture than there are differences. The same boats, the same docks, the same knowledge of the water, same seafood processing plants are all in play. And I think once you have a few folks dipping their toe in the water in aquaculture, it's suddenly, at least in places like Maine, it's not perfect, but I think there's aquaculture shifted from those foreigners, or foreigners in a generic way, those strangers coming in and doing aquaculture, to my neighbor's cousin is doing it, and hey, he's making some money at it too. And some perception shifted pretty rapidly. And even in places like Alaska, which they still have a ban on finfish farming, but there's a lot of interest in the fishing community and tribal communities, both fishing and, say, seaweed aquaculture. So I think those divisions have broken down, and there are opportunities, I guess, through Sea Grant, but also state programs to try to get fishermen more engaged in aquaculture.
And I was just going to say, in addition to commercial fishermen, what we've seen a lot of times in my facility and how we work with industry is, we've actually had seafood dealers, processors who recognize that they're not able to get the local seafood that they're used to getting, and that the product coming off their distribution trucks or aquaculture products from other countries. And they've come to us to engage because to them, they see the writing on the wall. I've got a 4th generation commercial dealer processor who's in his 20s and wants to stay here and wants to stay in business. And he wants to engage in aquaculture here so that he does have local product to supply to people. And he can tell that story to the people that come into his shop. And so it's not just getting commercial fishermen involved, right? It's getting some of these others in the supply chain involved as well. All righty. Are there additional questions? Examples? I see. Paul, did you highlight? Okay. All righty. And I don't see any additional questions in the chat. Ashley or Steve, do y'all have any closing remarks that y'all need to cover?
Ashley has posted in the chat. Have you posted there? Yes, there's a survey that we would love for anyone who joined today to take. There's a link there at 6:12 p.m. That'd be appreciated.
Alrighty. Well, I would like to thank our panelists certainly for joining and sharing that information. And I know that it has been recorded. I certainly think I would like to have a copy of the recording. Some good information was shared there. I thank you for letting me be the moderator. And so I do appreciate that, and just wanted to say that before Steve or somebody cuts us off on the Zoom.
Yeah, I do appreciate all of you, Kelly, for moderating, Drew, Dave, Paul. That's a wealth of information there, a lot of good follow-up sources in the chat, the links to consider, and I'd certainly puts it into perspective about where this is going and how it can be done well. Appreciate also the comments and the questions from the audience. It's definitely been an informative session. I'd say as good as any session we've had, and we will, as mentioned earlier, get this posted and make sure that the link is out there so you can share this with other folks and make sure they're all equally informed. Thanks very much, everyone.